Thank you to Volodya. It all functions well, I think. This is some sort of climax of this event. We have had several meetings already, and we were talking about the past collections of the museums. We were talking about the global museum boom on a global scale, I mean. And we were also talking about the creation of establishment of the Jewish museums in Poland and in Ukraine. And we have logically come down to the issue of the current status of museums in Ukraine in general. And today we have the exclusive opportunity to talk about this with the directors of some of the oldest museums in Ukraine and the museum that is still developing. The term changes is not available in the title of this discussion, but actually it is the connotation of every word in this title. So we are going to talk about the changes, and it is my pleasure to invite Tetyana Sosnovska, the director of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine in Kyiv. Tetyana has been the Museum of Tetyana for many years, and she implemented a number of innovative projects. They actually changed the perception of what the memorial museum in an apartment could be. It is also a very different combination of expertise, because for Tetyana, the museum was both the institution and the professional challenge, and also part of the family tradition. In 2014, the museum was first nominated among the municipal museums in the competition of the Council of Europe as the best museum of Europe. And one of the requirements was the implementation of changes in the recent period. In the beginning of 2015, Tetyana Sosnovska was appointed as an acting director of the National Museum, and one of the tasks was to implement reforms. That is why it is very important and it is very interesting that we have a chance to talk to you about this. And the second member of the board and the participant of discussion is Mr. Ihor Poshyvailo, the CEO of the National Memorial Complex of the Heavenly Hundred Heroes, the Museum of the Revolution of Dignity, ethnographer, researcher. He presented his PhD in the Institute of the Folklore Studies in the Academy of Sciences. He has worked for many years in the Ukrainian Center of Folk Culture, the Ivan Honchar Museum. He also was in charge of the information and promotion area, and for a year he went on a very important Fulbright scholarship in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, one of the leading institutions in the USA dealing with the heritage issues. In 2016, he has become a director of the Museum of the Revolution of Dignity. It is a very complex and complicated and very important museum, the museum that faces most of the challenges, I believe, and probably this is the first new state museum of this type. And the last but not least participant, Chmelyk, the director of the Lviv Historical Museum, the candidate of history. He has worked for many years in museum area, in particular in the Museum of Ethnography and Folk Art Crafts, and also he is the president of the Ukrainian Committee of ECOM, and in 2016 he won a contest and is the director of Lviv Historical Museum. So these 2 years, 2015 and 2016, were the turning point, and a very important turning point, and it is not by chance. That is why I will start with a very general issue that has been announced already. So what is your vision for changes, for the major changes? Why do we need them? Who needs them? And how do you see them from the point of view of your museum? I would like to invite Tetyana to start. Thank you for invitation. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to the colleagues and to be talking about the changes as we see them, as we implement them, and also to listen to your opinions about your vision of the changes, because we would always learn from each other. I have been appointed the Director General of the National Museum of the History of Ukraine because at some point, at some of the most important points in 2014, when after the Maidan events, people faced the issue of who we are, of what we are, what is our past, and what should our future be. At least in Kyiv, we could highlight a very specific trend. People got to be interested in their own past, in their own history, and they started going to museums. The museum I'm currently working at somehow was left behind the attention and focus of the Kyiv citizens, and we recorded that in 2014 there was a critical drop in the number of visitors in the National Museum of the History of Ukraine at the moment when the people were supposed to be interested in their history and they should have visited this museum. In our opinion, it was obvious that we should have offered some other formats of work of the museum with the visitors. The previous experience in the previous museum helped to have the museum nominated in the Best Museum of Europe contest, and therefore all of this motivated me to work in a new space and an absolutely new museum. I have been working with this team for 2.5 years already, and we realized that the most valuable thing for the museum is our collection and in its preservation and in its research, digitization, etc. Everything that is discussed by the museum people every day. But this is the collection which is part of the state fund. This is something we are proud of. And this collection is supposed to present the museum and the history in a way to have as many visitors as possible coming to the museum. After some discussions, which were not very long, but still there was some debate, we concluded that we will be able to fill the museum with another content and another life if we have a priority in our work on the visitor. We will be visitor-oriented and would try to focus on working with the visitors. Then this historical heritage that we are preserving will have the audience, and we will have somebody to communicate this heritage to. After some discussions, we concluded that our collection and the experience of the museum staff should be targeted at the visitors becoming permanently present, a permanently present element of the museum. We needed to understand that museums could only change when their spaces will be filled with an absolutely new content and essence that would be attractive for the visitors. I think if you're not quite ready to talk about that, or maybe you're not ready to admit it, but we have to admit it that we live in times of competition. In such big cities as Lviv, Kyiv and Kharkiv, museums do compete with one another, but this is the competition in a good sense. The museums actually have to compete much more with the internet, with the social media, because they actually steal the visitors from us, because most of the information, if not all of the information, could be obtained in the search engines on the internet. So we realized that we need to be able to stand against the competition with the internet and with the social media to make the visitors be willing to come to museums. We have very soon agreed that the visitors would only come to museums when the visit to the museum will be accompanied by some part of his life as emotions offer. So whenever the visitor comes to the museum to get some information, actually he can get this information on the internet, some knowledge that he can also get from the internet, but we should offer the emotion that will never be possible to get anywhere. So we decided our motto and the tagline would be that museums will have to work for the sake of visitors. On the other hand, it is not humiliating for the museum staff or for the researchers, because all of them, well, at least most of them, agreed that we are working for the sake of those for whom we are preserving our collection. Opting for this format of work and this tagline, the museum works for the sake of the visitors, and having organized several training sessions and lectures about the emotions in the museum, we developed the format of activities and the format of communicating with the audiences that actually gave some tangible results in a very short term. The museums made available almost all of the elements that we have heard about at the presentation with the colleague of Roman. The concept that we offered and presented to the community claimed that our museum, for the 5-year term of the implementation. Why 5 years? Because it actually largely depended on the duration of my contract. Within this time, I was supposed to do something that was planned and scheduled on this concept, and something I promised to my colleagues. So we had a very specific timeline of what we were supposed to do. Fortunately, nobody debated the fact that within this time, the museum should be modern in the form, European in the content, and Ukrainian in its spirit. So we tried to focus on these 3 objectives in our activities. Obviously, we had to reconsider the forms of work with different audiences. We had to identify the target audiences, which we believed were our primary audiences. Having understood that we were working for the sake of the visitors and to make the museum visit full of emotions, either positive or negative, or distress or elevated spirit, but it is only the emotion that can make a person come back to the same museum all over again, trying to understand that the interaction and the communication, at least with the tour guide or the exhibit itself, could add more emotions and more special meaning to your life. This was our choice. Whether it was right or not, you might argue. Whether it is going to be used in other museums and whether it is going to have the same positive effect might be arguable, but the results that we achieved were obvious, and we have achieved these results over the first 10 months of our work, and we actually managed to resume the number of visitors and income that was lost for 2013, and we realized there is some capacity with the museum team, and therefore the team has been changed and transformed. We have many more people on the staff with the scholarly degrees. We have 3 doctors of sciences and 24 candidates of sciences, and we realized that this was exactly the group of people who would be able to equally work with the scholarly description of the collection and also interacting with the visitors. We realized we were able to offer to the visitors the absolutely new level and quality of services, and we could undertake responsibility for shaping the community that are actually the civil society, which is on the stage of being shaped. I don't want to take much of your time from my colleagues, and I'm not entitled to do this. If you have any questions, I'm ready to answer them later. But our modernization approach was that we decided that it is the time to work for the visitors to satisfy the needs of the visitors. Thank you to Tetyana. I would like to invite the next speaker, Roman Chmelyk, as a representative of a very old institution with a huge experience and tradition in museum funds. What does change mean for you? Good evening. I would probably repeat some of the things that I mentioned during the presentation this morning, but I will try to rephrase these ideas at least. When talking about change, I believe no one has any choice in that situation. If the changes are there, you will either have to change yourself or you will stagnate and die out. I would like to say that museum is a living organism. It either dies or develops further. So if it does not change, there are no prospects for the future. But there is another question about the pace that these changes take. In the early 1990s, basically all of the museums had to change. They have changed. They have changed the visual representation. How did they change the visual representation? I will tell you about some of the experience, not to have this discussion too serious. I had this experience in the Museum of Ethnography. We had the study tour to Hutsul region, and in 1989 they sent the monument to Lenin to one of the collective farms. These still were collective farms. Actually, there was the independent Ukraine, and they needed to have the monument to Shevchenko replaced. So they didn't have any money. What did they do? They actually cut the head of this monument and put on the head of Shevchenko onto it. And it is still there until these days. So this is the type of change that we had in the museum. In place of the red flag, we have put the blue and yellow flag. And we are happy to claim that we have modernized, we have changed. Is this the change that we need? But also there is a question, are we able to do a different kind of change? We all understand that we need change, but who should be making this change and how? How do we do this if there is only one method in your head? Those who are not with us are automatically against us. Each new authority coming there would like to claim their space, and they offer their ideology to the society. And the museums are used as the tools for that in the implementation of certain political ambitions of this or that power group. That is why the change is needed, but the change shall be conceptual. Are we ready to make this change? I think now we have the time when the generation has been replaced. We've been in the independent state for over 25 years, and it is high time we changed something that we did in our museums in the early 1990s, back at the time when we were young and furious. And now we have the new generation, and they have to use our experience and do some different things. And I guess my generation of the directors are sort of opposed, because we do have some merits, we have some experience, we have seen things, we've been there and done that. But what you're offering is something which has not been tested, and it's too bold to implement. So to have a very simple answer to the question, I would like to say that the change is badly needed, but this change shall be filled with a certain content. And there are certain tools to do this, to make these changes meaningful. Obviously, we have to work on new concepts, on the development strategies for each institution. It might not be perfect, that's for sure. It's not going to be perfect immediately, but it will definitely include the experience of the people working on that strategy. After the strategy, whatever general or whatever detail it is, the first experiments will follow. And these experiments will be the most valuable thing we will be able to pass down to the next generation of the museum people. It's about the interpretation of events and the interpretation of objects. So I would advocate for the changes in the museums coming from the use of the museum as a tool of ideology and propaganda by any authorities, to have the museums become the platform for social dialogue, where everyone could find a chance to have their say, and also being able to listen to the other opinions. Thank you, Roman, for your vision and for your ideas that you shared. What about you, Ihor? Your museum, and something which is still part of our modernity, our present times, but it is also part of history already. This is probably the largest scale new museum. It is a very complicated museum that will have to set the standard of what we are able to do or what we have to do. Well, actually, in this context, I believe it's most easy for us trying to analyze the needs. We have to understand what kind of changes do we need. When talking about the museum field, we would like to establish the museum that would meet the expectations of the time and expectations of the society, and that is supposed to be a self-sufficient museum. We were visiting other countries in the world in other museums, and we can see the huge difference. And this banal basic experience as compared to the negative experience of visiting Soviet and post-Soviet museums that are objectively not interesting. They are closed, ideological. They are the tools of ideology and politics. As of today, they are not viable at all. They are not viable in financial terms, in ideological terms, and in the world representation meaning. And I believe for Ukrainian museum field, we need to have the change of the logics, the change of mentality and the attitude, the change of their functions. Whatever paradoxical it might sound, we do have the colleagues from the US, and I would have the example from the US. There is this famous museum expert in the US who was talking about the access of museums in the society. His quote is that museums of the future will have to meet the needs of the society. It shall be needed and understandable both for a simple soldier and the intelligentsia. So we need to answer this question ourselves. Are our museums, are our collections well accessible and understandable for all parts of society, for all strata of society and levels of society? We started talking about the change back in the 1990s, and this discussion got to be more active in the 2000s when we had a chance to actualize the experience of our colleagues from other countries where the museums are not merely successful, but they are the integral, harmonious part of the society. In the USA, people visit museums many more times, more often than in Ukraine, and over the last 10 years we can see how many new, interesting and wanted museums established are in different spheres. These are the museums of the so-called bad news or contested history. They are emerging because they are on demand. I believe that there is a demand for change in Ukraine, and the museums have to be open, inclusive, dynamic and interesting. What do we need to do for that? Each museum finds itself in a different context. Somebody would lack facilities, the others would lack funding, the others would lack the relevant team for the communication with the society. But one of the most important elements mentioned by Roman, so that museums were not used by politicians. So we need to create the museum that matters, the museum that produces change and has an influence that are listening to. And this is not the abstract idea, this is not a utopia, this is a tangible model of a Western museum supported by the rest of the society. The museum will only be successful when it has large audiences and many numbers of visitors, and these museums will also be popular with the donors and sponsors. Especially we see this with the example of the museums in other countries where they had modernization, or maybe the exhibition was changed or new exhibition changes. Most of the museums even have long lines in order to attract the investors for the museums. This is a very important sign and a factor. We need to have a comprehensive approach and vision of the mission of the museum. What new senses shall museums generate, and for whom? If we talk about the Museum of Historical Memory, what kind of memory shall be preserved, presented and interpreted? For whom? Why? What are the prospects of these museums in the near future? trying to answer all of these questions, we will be able to address the processes that will help us change the museums. Talking in more practical terms, in 2013, 14 and 15, the Maidan events, the Revolution of Dignity, was a test for Ukrainian museums to test their mission. Who do they serve? The society, the politicians, the authorities, or who? And the answer would be quite rhetorical, because most of the museums are state museums, municipal museums. They largely depend on the state funding. And David Fleming mentioned a very important thing. I believe you know him. This is the director of the Association Museums in Liverpool. He was talking about the social responsibility of museums and also the political tint of the museum. Why should museums be political? Do they serve the politics, or should they be neutral, or should they pretend to be neutral? Whatever paradoxical it might sound, but according to his conclusions, most museums are political. But some museums do admit it, and the others are trying to hide it. So actually, we all remember the situation when the museum sphere and the cultural sphere, broader, the archives, the libraries, the cultural institutions, in the situation of the deep conflict between the society and the authorities, found themselves at an absolute loss. They were not sure how they should be responding to the new changes in the society, or maybe they had to be neutral, or maybe supporting the society. The Tetyana Museum, the Lviv Historical Museum, and many other museums, they actually spoke in support of this position. The Tetyana Museum actually expressed their support from the very first days. Ukraine actually took a break, took a pause, took their time, and then expressed their opinion, expressing not supporting violence. So these are some internal challenges that are indicative. Thank you. So we have already the list of ideas of who would the museums be designed for. We have the visitors. We're talking about the need for new concepts. We also have museums as the receivers of these changes. We're talking about the subjectivization of the museums. They are not only the object or the communicator of the ideology. How do we reach all of this? How do we develop new relations, new content, new meanings, new senses, and new forms? So my second question would combine two of the questions I planned initially. So who are your models? What are your models? Both positive, negative, the models you're following when you design your steps in the activities of the museum. So this is first part of the question. And the second part of the question is more of the applied nature, maybe some of the examples, illustrations, so that we could feel something and imagine some of the things. Can you have the illustration, the example of a project in your museum, maybe some exhibition or something else that you believe to be critically important, but also very complicated at the same time? One example, maybe we shall start with Roman. To be honest, we agreed with Sofia. She would appoint me the last speaker all the time. I was the second one in the first question, and now I'm the first one in the second question. Since I am local, and usually you will have to honor your guests and give the floor to them first. But anyway, when we're talking about some complicated, contested and controversial examples, I would like to say that Lviv Historical Museum now faces certain challenges. The first challenge is, how do we show the liberation fight? We all know that there is the Liberation Fight Museum in Lysenko Street. How are we trying to present it? I believe the same way we used to present the Second World War in the Soviet museum times. It is a very similar approach. These are the museums of the military glory. Does it really meet the reality? Let's think about it. Are we talking about the liberation fight only for those who were keeping the weapons and the guns in their hands? Are there any other methods to get the state? Or maybe we do not have the experience. We do have the experience, but it is not presented in the exhibitions. Therefore, we are sort of narrowing the range of activities of our Ukrainian people in their deeds to build the state. So this is one of the challenges. And the second challenge is that, well, the permanent exhibition there is, we should have had the Museum of the History of the City of Lviv. It's paradoxical, but the Lviv Historical Museum does not tell anything about the history of the city of Lviv, even though next year we celebrate the anniversary of 125 years. But actually, it was originally the Museum of the City of Lviv, and the magistrate bought the Black Townhouse for that purpose. So we do face this challenge currently, how to show the history of the city of Lviv. Of course, the tradition of the 20th century and the trend of the 20th century is to show the ethnocentric approach, and the expectations of the community would be this way. Everyone wants to see their history in the best possible light. I'm not even talking about the victimity in our history. It is the indispensable element in our history. So are we supposed to show it this way? And then we will actually transfer to the examples, the positive things. One of the first trips with the group who were working on the strategy was the trip to Wrocław. It is a beautiful city of Rostov. It's not so far away, but it is also located at the border with Germany, the borderland city. So the first museum we visited was the Urban Museum of Wrocław, and there was this exhibition for the millennium, the 1,000 years of Wrocław, and this part that belonged to Poland is very small, but they actually managed to show this in dignified manner. Whoever the town, the city used to belong to, they actually managed to show all elements of the contested history of Wrocław in a very proper and dignified way. Another museum I would like to share about is the Fanta-Museum Museum. It is a very modern and state-of-the-art museum in terms of technical maintenance and support. Also, the next year is the anniversary of the Ukrainian 100th anniversary of the Ukrainian People's Republic, and also 100 years of the Polish independence. Obviously, they will have to recall of who they were fighting against. So the Poles were fighting against Ukrainians, and Ukrainians fought against the Poles. So this topic of the Ukrainian-Polish war for Lviv would definitely emerge. So how are we going to present it, and how would the Poles be presenting it? Actually, I suggested some ideas, and I talked to Mr. Yizvenko, some person in charge of the Osolineum Museum. So I suggested we have the shared exhibition, and we would have to present it both in Lviv and in Wrocław. And the core message would be that all of those who were fighting for their independence are entitled to be respected. Each nation is entitled to be independent. They have the right to be independent. We do not need to deepen these gaps in the Polish-Ukrainian relations. We need to show that the fight for independence is always the holy deed, but your contestant fighting for his independence is also entitled for that. So the working title of this project is Our Right is Resurrection. So the right of each nation is to get their independence, but at the same time, you need to be respectful for the independence of other nations. We're now considering how to implement this project, and in 2018 we are going to launch it and to implement it. So these are the challenges we are facing at the moment. Thank you. What about you, Ihor? Talking about challenges, there are very many of them. In particular, to be more specific about the Museum of Maidan, one of the first challenges was how to preserve this recent hot history and not to get burnt of it. How do we change the subjects of history into the objects of history presented behind the glass in the showcases? How do we create museums not about the specific historical events, but the museum that would be there to reconsider and rethink the historical processes? They will have to be based on the past, but be looking into the future. This is supposed to be the museum as a platform for the development and shaping of certain position and a critical approach, the reactivation of the civic initiatives that have sporadically emerged at Maidan. How do we develop and build and show not the two sides of the confrontation, something that Roman mentioned, in many historical museums talking about their dramatic history, because the First World War and the Second World War, this is not the problem of Ukraine only. We are either talking about glorification or victimization. How do we find and how do we develop this poly-narrative, poly-narration to show different sides of the situation? And there are actually many challenges like that, and many models how our neighbors are tackling these issues. I used to attend many museums in the USA, and actually I had an impression that their experience is not that perfect. It needed a lot of adjustment for ours and for our needs. In terms of the educational approach and attitudes, like educating children, are very different, and the funding systems are very different. The European experience is much closer to us. So in that respect, when we were establishing this museum, we had several study trips to Poland, such as we were trying to find a model, the sample that would be the best possible model for the Museum of Maidan. So we analyzed the Museum of the Warsaw unrest, and this museum helped Warsaw citizens develop their identity, and this is the global trend, because mostly, large cities, they are developing their identity around certain landmark events. For Kyiv, this is the recent history and the event that deserves memorialization and deserves developing the infrastructure that could help expand and enhance the tourism sphere and get a lot of benefits, or rather advantages for different fields of the city life. In that respect, the European Solidarity Center was very interesting for us. Each of the models have their own advantages and disadvantages. Recently, we've had a working trip to 3 countries, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Most of the museums that we attended, like 10 museums, were not popular among the average visitors. If I went to these countries, I would never go to these museums. They are not so famous or well known for the broad audiences. The Mechelny Museum, the Kazarna de Sin, the museum about the former ghetto, where this site, some so-called camp for different minorities like Jews, Roma, or others. On the one hand, this is the memorial, but right opposite the street, there is the museum complex. So my most illustrative case is the Museum of Resistance movement in Amsterdam. This is a small museum, 20 years old, and the main exhibition, well, mostly this is the museum for the adults. The exhibition is quite creative for the time, but it's morally outdated. But the most important part of this museum is the part for children. I believe it is quite an experiment when we analyze its facility, and it has a lot and involves a lot of emotions, as Tetyana mentioned, that museums in Ukraine lack emotions. So this museum has been designed on the basis of the experience of 4 children. The child from the family of the mayor of the city who collaborated with the Nazis, the child from the resistance movement family, and the Jewish family child, and just a child with neither of the positions, who was just a collector. And this is a huge problem for the Netherlands, in fact, being passive and undecided. So a large part of the exhibition is built on the story of these 4 children. And these methods they used are really impressive. They have these nurseries, the things and belongings of the kids, and the story when the child had to be hiding in some shelters, and there is this element when the child was playing with the shadow and lights. So these are very important and emotional things. And the most unexpected was the last room, where people could leave their emotions and impressions and opinions. So the monitors had the videos of the children that are still living, but they are adults already. And they are showing their impressions and their visions and the analysis of what happened to them over this period of time, or what happened to them back then. And I believe this experience of the girl who came from the collaborants family, she had 2 conclusions. The first conclusion was she would never join any community, any movement or else. And the second conclusion was that the May 9 was not a holiday for her. It was not the victory day for her, because after the Second World War, she was arrested, she was tortured, she was despised, nobody made friends of her. She had only 2 photographs in her room. In one photo she was with other children, and in another photo she was there alone. She has never had any friends afterwards. So this is the personal trauma and tragedy of this little girl. As it turned out, the relatives of this family, in particular the grandson, actually took this museum to court, because actually revealing this story without the agreement of this family turned out to be quite problematic, because he claimed it could bring some discomfort to other generations of the family. And therefore, it is also a challenge for us. How do we show and present the stories of Maidan participants? And these are the stories that were relevant not only for the eyewitnesses and participants of these events, but also for the other generations that will be linked to them personally. I will first answer your first question. Which museums do we consider to be a model for ourselves? The closest model and sample, I believe I would like to see them closest to us, so that we could attend them as often as possible and to have the dialogue with the staff of these institutions. For me and for most of our staff, the model is and has been the art arsenal in the forms of work that they offer to the visitors. Talking about the examples and samples and models of foreign museums, I personally favor the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising and the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, even though they are very different, but both of them can teach you a lot, and you can borrow many things from each of them. I'm not talking about copy-pasting, but I'm talking about borrowing some of the ideas. I will always remember for a long time the emotions of the visit of the private museum in the city hall in Brugge. I did not intend to attend this museum because private museums is something that we would not be able to replicate, but I was there with my family, so we arranged we would go there. And the trip and the visit to this museum is some sort of the synergy of sound, colors, the play of light, music and sound, and you would hear the voice of the tour guide from somewhere. There is no exhibit in that museum, but when you get out of the museum, you feel disappointed. Is that all? And you cannot go back because the door is closed behind you. So when I went to this museum some 6 months ago, I realized that in our museums we lack the sound, and I realized that I am really irritated about this silence, like in the cemetery, and actually is the silence that pushes you away from the museum room. So we added sound to some of the exhibitions in some rooms, some of the background music or sound, but this is still not enough and not to compare with this Brugge Museum. Maybe some of my children and the future generations would be able to implement them. In the Solidarity Museum, we realized that some of the designer elements of the exhibition could be borrowed, but only some of them, not the entire exhibition at all. What we liked about the museum, we liked the second part, the research part, the scholarly part. This is the library and the platform for open debate. This is something that each museum lacks in a country. This is something we are trying to develop in our museum from the very first day, but we do lack this academic part, the library. I really am in favor of the Museum of Terror in Budapest as a museum, and also the story of its design and development, developing the concept, designing the exhibition, and how it functions these days. Maria Schmidt, the director of this museum, comes from the repressed family herself. That is why, for her, the design of this museum was the matter of personal family memory about her father, the grandfather, and other family members. When Maria Schmidt was establishing this museum, she believed that the design solutions, which was the best, it came from the cinema producers and cinema directors who were able to show the white color and the black color and the gray color in between, to show that there is this something in between the happiness and unhappiness. So Maria Schmidt actually instilled this persistence in me that helps me a lot these days. She told me something. When I started creating this museum, everyone believed I was playing with the idea. But when we approved the design, when we had the concept ready, and when we started making the museum, my opponents realized that we actually started making the museum and we are going to put this to an end. She told me that she was largely criticized, and after 2 months she told to her kids that she will take care of the grandchildren, because she had 5 of them, even though she is still too young. But the kids replied, "Mom, we are going to support you because you have to do this." And the daughter said, "Mom, please keep working, and we will then be considering you quite a popular woman." On the day of the opening of the museum, they presented a gift to her, a large box, and there were some recordings of criticizing on TV and on radio, and some of the excerpts from the newspapers of the 3 years. There was about 2,500 pieces of criticism. But actually, her daughter said, "You made a museum where I would like to bring my friends to." So when she heard this from her daughter, she said she realized she had to employ the staff of the age of her children approximately, because this was supposed to be the museum of the future. When she checked who was standing in the line to visit the museum, these were mostly young people. So the format of work of this museum is a sample and model for me. So when actually gave the ICOM card, I'm not a member of ICOM, and I'm borrowing it from my friends whenever I go abroad because I want to save. And there was this lady of the age of my daughter, and she told me proudly, very proudly, that we are not members of the ICOM and we have equal conditions for everyone. So this is about the pride of their achievements that deserves some envy. The history of the 20th century presented in our museum, actually, we do understand that it must be presented as the history of the continuous fight of the nation and the liberation movements that have been going step by step to the independence of Ukraine, overcoming the barriers. So we decided not to have the chronological approach in our exhibition. We were trying to show the main stages of the torments of the Ukrainian nation. In one of the rooms where we want to have the exhibition to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Ukrainian insurgent army and the Stalin terror as well. These are two exhibitions. Working on these two exhibitions, in particular on the second exhibition, we can feel some hidden resistance and misunderstanding. And we needed to sit down together and overcome these misunderstandings. Thank you. I have very many questions, but I can see that it took us 50 minutes already. Yes, it has. So I will take my turn with the questions, but to start with, I would like to ask you to have your questions brief, as concise as you can. Everyone in this room knows that it's my problem. Thank you very much for a very specific talk. Because this discussion about the need for changes, it has already been started and initiated, and we all know about some of the general things, that the museum shall be interactive, open, and visitor-oriented. But thank you for your specific examples and also for your specific problems you shared. I have several questions. Question number one to you, Ihor. First of all, I keep track of your work and I do wish a lot of success to you, because this is going to be the first museum ever created in the independence times. I was trying to analyze your interviews. You were criticizing this glorification. I don't support it either, but in your interviews I could see some, well, you were talking about this continuity of history that shall be present in your museum. It should refer to all of the previous revolutions, and this continuity is also quite glorified. How does it refer to your criticism of glorification in the exhibitions? The second thing is that you closely work together with the Institute of National Memory, that are quite definite, quite subjective in their attitudes, especially when we talk about, well, first of all, they would advocate for the glorification of history, and also when talking about the Second World War, there are many issues to raise. How do you manage to work together? How do you cope with the fact that your partner is largely distorting the discussion of what has happened in the past? And the second question I have to Tetyana, and this is going to be a remark rather, but I have to say this, I have to voice it. Well, the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising used to be joked around, but it's quite sad, not funny. So the pupils who come to this museum, they actually leave with the impression that the Poles have actually won in the Warsaw Uprising. This museum is largely ideologically dependent. They want to bring up the generation that will never go out to the streets. They will never walk out to the streets the way they're doing today. So this is the question to all of you, because all of you deal with the historical museums. You find it more difficult than the art museums, etc. What impressed you that much in that museum? Have you spotted this ideology bias in this museum? And the last question to Roman. Well, thank you for the presentation we had today. It was very bold and very courageous to take on such a large thing in the city and try to reform it. It is a huge effort and it's very bold. I have this question about Mickiewicz Museum. In this presentation, you claim that this is the museum that has no future because it's developed on new technologies in terms of narration, and it's going to die in several years. And now you claim this is the example for you, so I'm trying to figure out. Try to be brief. I will start because I will be very brief as usual. As far as the Fanta-Museum Museum, at the presentation, I claimed that was one of the examples of the application of new technologies that should be followed. It's worth following. But another question is how closely we should be following these technologies. We have to remember about this. And there is this active debate among the museum staff over the Poland and other countries of the world. So I would actually tend to think that technologies are just the subject. When you design certain concept and draft certain budget for the exhibition, from this moment of the start of the drafting of this project and until the day of implementation, it could take some 2 years. During this time, all of the technologies will be outdated. We have to take it for granted that the computer technologies would actually develop at a large pace. We should not try to glorify them that much. There should be some balance, some proper proportion in every museum between the monuments and the technologies. We should not be going down to the virtual museums. Of course, they have their right for existence, but this is something different. I will start with the second question about the Institute of National Memory. You know, well, it has historically developed the way that our initiative group, since the National Museum, the State National Museum, has come from some basis. We had the initiative group in January 2014. There was the Museum of Maidan. Later, they joined another initiative, the Museum of Freedom. There was the Post-Maidan initiative. Many of you know Yevhen Hlibovetsky and Alexandra Baklanova. Actually, the staff of the Institute of National Memory joined this initiative, several other colleagues. We collected the exhibits during the Revolution of Dignity. We developed the first concepts and were part of the first working groups. That this museum, our museum, was transferred to the subordination of the operations to this institute. I think it's more difficult to work with the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine today, which is no less biased than the Institute of National Memory these days. Actually, the relations with this institution is quite a natural thing, because there is the clear understanding for designing the rules and the concept of the politics of memory. So far, it is still undecided, and all of the attempts and some of the mistakes each of us makes is the consequence of the previous negative experience we had in our attitude to history that has been distorted, that has been silenced and falsified. So we're talking about the ethnographic museums, the other types of museums. They are also falling victims to some myths and stereotypes. So we have to work a lot in that field as yet. I also mentioned the museum in Mykhalenia, and I believe the advantage of this museum is that they have a larger context. It's not only about the Jews or the Holocaust. It's about the discrimination in a broader context. They start with a film with the obese boy, and he actually suffers discrimination in the group of his peers, and this discrimination is shown in Africa and other countries, gender discrimination and others. And we are trying to deal with the phenomenon of Maidan as with the thing that is based on this continuity. This is not something that emerged spontaneously. This is about defending the values of rights and freedoms. Yaroslav Hrytsak is talking about the Maidan revolution as the consequence of the uncompleted revolutions of the 1990s. So we are not going to focus on the liberation fights as the historical museums do. We would like to offer a broader context, trying to explain where does this victimization comes from, where the traditional values are coming from, where these key principles are coming from. And actually we are here today in the City Hall not by chance. It's about the right of the community for decision making. And currently we have two positions on that matter, such as they are trying to, on the one hand, to forget the memory of Maidan. We have other challenges, economic challenges, the warfare, etc. On the other hand, we are a sort of degrading the events that were taking place in the Maidan. We had the exhibition, it was hosted by Lviv Polytechnics, it traveled all over Ukraine. In August it's going to be in Chicago, and then in the Scottish Parliament, and in Edinburgh in December. And we are trying to show the actual landmark but very symbolic events of our history. We're talking about Holodny Yar, about siege riflemen. This line of fight, which is continuous, is not known for the wide audiences. The historical textbooks tell about history only in terms of dates and numbers and the list of battles. But we have no ideas about the stories of average people, the people who were engaged in all of these activities. And these are the stories that are very close and understandable for us today. The Museum of Warsaw Uprising, when it was established and created, they wanted to understand what their target audiences would be and how to design the museum largely focusing on this target. Actually, the team of this museum found it very difficult to start their work because they were largely criticized, but the young team didn't really pay attention to them. So one of the journalists claimed that these young, bold, fearless people would do whatever they want. So actually they targeted the 12, 13, 10, 13-year-olds, but then they enlarged this range to 15 years old. So they actually planned it this way: when the child actually would receive information in the game process, in play, and then some of this information would emerge later in the memory more effectively. So this is the play, the game of emerging into the times that would actually come up in the memory of this child as adult, and then this information will be perceived not as a game just running around and looking into the small holes, but as some information that will be based on the history lessons in school and then integrating into some conclusions. Since the museum actually targets children, I went there as a museum worker. So we were walking to this museum. We were walking through a noisy, crowded street. When we walked into the museum, I felt that all of these sounds of gunshots, of the noises of the underground city are pushing me away. I'm not able to tolerate this human grief, even though I still wanted to see more of the visual effects, the multimedia effects. I wanted to be there as an expert, but I could not tolerate staying there as a person. So I tried to understand how long would people manage to stay there. So when I went out to the street, I actually took this noisy street as the quiet heaven and paradise. So actually, can you imagine the difference and these impressions they're trying to produce, giving you cripples actually? I have a short remark. We would very often tend to say that we lack resources for changes, including financial resources, that we could have more people, we could have more repairs, we could buy more updated devices. So I'm afraid that with these capacities we will be able to build a very attractive, very emotional and very well designed ideological machine in the end. And it really scares me because I really have fear to understand and realize what kind of visitor I'm going to be there. The visitor that comes to the museum and realizes this is not my story. This is the story and history about the people who are there, but many are also missing. So we historians very often are discussing what the history of Ukraine is. And here we have the directors of two museums. One of them is describing, well, they have the history of Ukraine in their name, and the second name is Lviv Historical Museum. And Roman is telling us that one of the projects is the history of the city. So I guess, how are we going to correlate the history of the country as the history of the liberation, a fight of the Ukrainian nation for their freedom, with the history of the city of Lviv in the 20th century, with the history of the city that had Polish citizens before the war, and they were forcefully displaced, and we sometimes live in their houses, and we are also now in the building that mattered to some people some time ago. So what would be the place to talk about that? Then we would not go to the museum, we would go to the internet or maybe elsewhere. That's why I'm thinking about the following question. What kind of society are we talking about? How do we view the visitors? Is this just the number? The larger the number, the better? Or maybe the visitors are somebody who shall be impressed? Or maybe we see visitors as people who we actually converse with, and maybe this is somebody who could be the co-author of the exhibition, who could afford having different interpretations of some events. If we get back to the museum that actually impressed many, this is the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, and you also mentioned the Museum of Terror, the House of Terror in Budapest. These are two museums that are highly modern, highly emotional, highly impressive. They had long lines of visitors trying to get there. But when we talk about, for example, the Museum of Warsaw Uprising, it's very ideological. It's very epic. It only shows one version and attitudes to the uprising. It only claims that the uprising was good and you needed to die. It doesn't mention any critical voices voiced before, during, and after. So, because there was a lot of criticism of the uprising and dying in the Polish language. We're talking about the 19th century, but we don't claim this is also part of the history of Ukraine. We're talking about the two uprisings, actually. And the second museum in the Budapest, that probably has less visitors, but it's also very close to us. They talking about black and white, and they actually talk very little about the gray color. They're dividing rather than enhancing discussion. Taking a look on the person creating this museum, because she comes from the repressed family, so she has the right for this opinion. But does the society need this kind of museum? What does that imply for the society? I'm not here to draw any parallels, but these two large museums which have large numbers of visitors, and there is Ukraine, and it has the university and the threat of being closed down, and there is a country where people are walking out because the judicial are under threat. So actually, I would like to highlight that we are not talking about the past, but in fact, we are talking about the future. It's very responsible and scary. Let's get back to the room, to the audience, and I hope you have questions. I'll be brief because Sofia actually made it very simple for me. I actually expected worse, because attending museums in Ukraine, I could say that they are telling a very sad, a very Soviet, a very nationalistic history. But I actually heard a lot of optimistic ideas from you, so it makes me feel happy, but I'm still really concerned about some of your words. You all claim that you're a state museums and you keep talking about ideology, and I'm really concerned about that. It's concerning. I can see that you're ready to get away from this state ideology that is imminently hanging above you, but there might be some times where you will be speaking in the unison instead of wasting your time and emotions and energy to develop the concept. You will just be there under the supervision of some institution and telling this story. So this ideological approach shall be excluded from the museums, and ideology generally shall be excluded. It shall be substituted by the concept-based approach. So my first question to you is, do you have the teams, the established teams that are developing the concepts? Only your concept only, not looking back on the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, not looking back on some of the state institutes like academies of sciences, etc., because there's a lot of confrontation and diversity in there. The concept of Ukrainian history is unfortunately based on the fight only. And Tetyana rightfully mentioned that this is going to be the history of fight of Ukrainian nation. Ukrainian had the periods, the ages even, of not fighting. So I'm going to be silent about that. It's not only about fighting when we talk about the Ukrainian nation. So I'm not going to mention this in your exhibitions. And actually, I am opposed to this approach, so that we actually bring down the history of Ukraine to political history. Politics only takes some 3 to 5% of our lives. So if you're going to show the lives of people, of Ukrainians or other nations who used to live within this or that space, this is going to be interesting to visitors. I will never go to the museum who will actually try to process me ideologically, trying to say, let's all be monolith, mobilized, etc., or this way or the other way. That is why I don't want to be the evil Cassandra, but I think your concept for 5-year-olds is going to be futile. Could I answer? Well, actually, you haven't seen the entire concept, but now you ask the question that would require more details. But we are really pressed for time. As to your remark, maybe I failed to mention this, or maybe you failed to hear, but we're talking about the redesigning the exhibition of the 3rd floor, where they talk about the 20th century history, and this exhibition hasn't changed since 1976. Some of the elements have been taken away after the independence times, or the texts have been changed. This is the format that absolutely is not acceptable in the Historical Museum in the 26th year of independence. The group that developed the concept for us was oriented for the following parameters of the work of the museum in presenting the 20th century history. We're talking about the 20th century that is still not far away in every family, and it's close to every family through the stories of their parents and grandparents. We actually plan the exhibition in 4 or 5 years to focus on the fact that every person coming to a museum could be able to find his or her impression and some story related to his or her own family story, and taking it as the 20th century history. At the same time, we are relying on the recommendations, concepts, or current trends of German museum experts when in the historical museums they present the facts without any comments or conclusions or assumptions. A person is supposed to get the facts and draw the conclusions independently, adding some own search for some new facts and history. A person shall be in the constant search of the truth for himself or herself, having received the facts from the museum. Even the tours are now designed in a way, I think it's in the last 18 months, obviously, because I didn't address the tours immediately. So we ask the tours guides not to mention any personal opinions or some assumptions. So we actually ask the tour guides to offer as many facts as possible so that people could actually take their own positions. Talking about some of the pages of history that have never been mentioned before, but are now brought forward. We cannot ignore them. But from the very first day and from the very first month of my work, we have introduced the open discussion platform, and we are discussing these burning issues. First, there is a lecture to present this issue, and then we have 2 or 3 hours of discussions and debates. But these lectures are delivered by historians who are able to offer the arguments to refute or to support this or that assumption. This is to complement the imperfect exhibition that we inherited. We have to keep going. We have to engage the visitors with the additional formats of work. Some of the colleagues decide to close down the exhibition of the 20th century, and part of the museum is blocked and not functions. We are not able to exclude the 20th century from our history, at least because this is part of our life, part of our history, of our parents, our grandparents. Each of them had their own achievements and failures at that time. That's why we're trying to have this mix of different forms of work. But the tour guides, currently we are doing the test tours from time to time, and the tour guides would never have their specific assumptions, but offer the facts to have the visitors develop their own visions. I have a very brief question, because when you're saying the word fact, the historian would have his blood pressure going up. We are replacing the willingness of being objective with dry facts, but the selection of the fact is probably one of the most subjective and selective actions. I'm not sure. Yes, the fact can provoke a discussion, but I think that bringing forward certain issues, openness, controversy, not the strict line of presentation, this is the way to provoke people for thinking, for articulating and sharing their opinions. And this is a good question to discuss in general, whether a historical museum is the museum of facts at all. I would rather doubt or question it. We have other questions about the changes and the future of historical museums. I spent last 9 months in Warsaw. I had a research project, museum as an active subject of the public space, the experience of the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising, and before that I have worked for several years in one of Lviv museums. In my research, I had the following conclusions: that Ukrainian museums are taking the road that Poland has taken after 1989. So we are taking the same road. In particular, the experience of Polish museums, this is the conclusion of my research work, of course, we are taking basically the same road. One of the most complicated and difficult change is the systemic change. We could change something in a museum, but if the museum is in place, you might be talking about the need of changes, but they will never be implemented. I mean the professional staff and the qualifications of the museum staff. Because museum is one thing, but the museum team is another thing. We're talking about the European form of museums. So, a case study. In order to get for the international internship program, I had to resign from the museum because there are no norms, no standards that a person who has passed 3 stages of the international competition and is doing the research for 9 months and is already highly qualified and competent shall resign. This is not a problem for people who want to grow professionally. But after I came back from my internship, I haven't received any invitation from the museum to come back, even though I initially decided I would not be going back to the museum field. So the situation is At the international internship program, we had 3 museum people from different museums in Ukraine. None of them went back to the museums. So I have a question to you, because I could be talking about the Museum of the Warsaw Uprising. I have had internship in the promotion and education center for Polin Museum as well for 1 month, and I personally know the directors and the authors of these museums. But my question is to you as the managers, as the directors, as the managerial staff, the administrators of the museums. Are you making any changes? Well, which challenges do you face, and how do you influence these changes even on the legislative level? We know that museums sometimes do some things. They are writing these paper books. A person could be writing for the whole day and actually copying from the electronic format manually into the paper book, even though the world is moving forward. So when I explained to them that we're having these record books done manually, they couldn't believe their ears. And I believe the directors of the historical museums could influence this change, and they are there to be the advocates and the leaders of change and the agents of change, actually. Well, if we want to have the specific individual managers and administrators implement some changes, we need certain tools for that. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, this tool is the Museum Council at the Ministry of Culture, and it should have a quite representative composition, certain consolidation and professional level to have some recommendations that the Ministry of Culture shall offer for the implementation. We have Irina Podolyak here, and at least one of the attempts, at least the competitive selection of the directors for museums has been made. And this is the first step, at least. As to the high-quality professional education, this is a huge problem in Ukraine. Unfortunately, directors of museums have nothing to do with that, but they should have. And unfortunately, there is no close cooperation between the Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Education. No cooperation. So we're talking about the extracurricular education and Ukrainian school pupils visiting the museums. We have negative experience in that. So, because we cannot arrange the systematic visits of the school pupils to the museums, you cannot include it officially into the school curricula. So this is about the individual approach of each director, which criteria he would use to select the team members. I know some of the conservative directors for most of the Ukrainian museums find it very uncomfortable and inconvenient to have people like you on their teams, people who understand the need for structural changes, who are intellectually much higher than some of the officials and who have a new approach. And we also discussed this problem. Who is going to be more efficient in Ukraine these days? A public official with the specific relations to the authorities, who can understand the bureaucratic peculiarities, who is aware of the legislative area, who can actually get the due funds allocated for the guard security and salaries? Or do we need a visionary? Who is more important for the museums today? I do not have any specific answer, but I believe it should be some sort of symbiosis, because in this transition period, none of these extreme approaches are going to work, because we have the examples of some romantic approaches for the directors of the museums, but they have no idea and have no clue how to tackle some of the practical everyday issues, how to get the funds allocated, etc., etc. Maybe Roman would like to add something. Actually, I answered a similar question today from the lecturer from the Institute of Culture. She asked whether we are ready to employ some new young people. I've had several interviews recently, and I'm actually ready to employ and I'm able to employ. So I asked them, what can you offer to the Lviv Historical Museum? Only one of the several of them claimed that I know more or less that your museum stock and funds or this and that, and I think it would be interesting for me to prepare this or that project like the exhibition, the catalog, but most of the, so I'm ready to talk to this person, but most of them have no idea. They just claim they need a job and they're ready to do anything. So I'm not sure this is going to be the person I could implement the ideas I have. I think this is just a problem of the training, of the education, and I think, maybe this is not the correct or tolerant question, I think it's not proper at all, it's not good. You will never go to the museum field again. I think it is not fair in terms of the scholarship that you used. I'm sorry if I insulted you. May I answer? I'm not sure how to address you, unfortunately. You're not the first person to complain about having to resign from the museum in order to apply for some grant proposal or the scholarship trip. Unfortunately, we do have the cases like this. I can only advise to you, don't be mad at your director. Maybe he was in a bad mood, or maybe he was under the influence of other circumstances. What do I do? Well, actually, we do not have. Exactly. If a person leaves for 6 months, he or she will have to resign. Actually, none of the commissions had any remarks to us in such cases, whether we like it or not, but we live in the conditions of the legislation and laws that are dictating to us the format of work as directors. And actually, step or act left or right would equal the suicide, but there is this financial liability that is on the director. Of course, if you leave for several months or for some 6 months for your scholarship, for the study trip, and you want to get back to the museum and the director wants to keep you in the museum team, in these cases I would actually allow this person against the labor code to have the unpaid leave, not for 15 days, but for the period of the study trip. So whenever the inspection comes, they come that 15 days only are allowed. But I retort that we don't pay the salary to this person for the duration of this scholarship, but we actually kept the position. Maybe your director had no idea about this solution. Maybe my experience is going to be useful for other directors of museums, because if it's the University of Culture of the University of Franco University, etc., etc., the young person graduates from, usually and mostly, and it's quite natural, the graduate comes to the museum not as a ready-made professional, but just because they want to get a job or they want to be engaged in the museum field. And this is just a human factor. So I would actually act differently than Roman. We are asking what was the research topic of the graduate during his studies at the university. We're trying to check whether this unit or section of the museum has the vacancies in that field, trying to figure out whether we badly need this expert or not. And then we actually try to analyze which is the primary work we need, maybe the tour guides or the description of the collection or other things like research field. And then we actually offer the position to this person and try to understand whether this is the right choice, and then we also allow this person to draw the conclusions for himself or for herself, whether this is the field the person would feel happy about, and then we will together decide eventually. It's human to err, and it's human to make mistakes, and have some illusions about this or that field. So maybe my experience like this would help other experts to have the new worker coming back well read and well known, actually with a lot of ideas. And well, actually we will have to say that this scheme is not only about finding the loopholes in the legislation, which is already a problem, but I don't think it is going to favor, well, it does favor the experts leaving, but doesn't favor the experts coming back. And this is also the important thing to discuss, because we're talking about changes, the changes that should be invested into. It's not about the people who will just come and do something instead of us. I think this is the twofold approach. The responsibility is actually on somebody who has more authorities. And I think this is the responsibility of the museums. At least this is my opinion as a director. Maybe we could collect some questions, several questions, and then we will have the general summarizing answers. I have the question, since I represent young people, I'm very young, I am still a school pupil. How could a museum be closer to people? Ihor rightfully mentioned that museum cannot function as a separate structure. It shall be understandable and close to people. And I can see very often among my peers that most of our typical museums don't make you feel like loving history. So my question is, how are you getting closer to the people? How are you trying to understand their needs to get them interested to visit you and generally to be fond of history, trying to understand it? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce myself, Simkin, the international reporter, the member of the initiative group of Ukrainian intelligentsia of intellectuals dealing with the issues of resuming the activity of the institution, the Jewish Museum, that was closed by the Bolshevik authorities in 1941. And I would like to remind all of those people coming here, and for me, as a person who is not biased at all, here we have some renowned scholars and figures of history and culture, but except for Roman Chmelyk, a highly intellectual and tolerant person who had the exhibition for Crimean Tatars and Jewish community of Lviv, I have the impression that we are here today just to discuss the labor code or whatever, and some issues about the visits to different museums. The topic of this meeting is the Jewish days in the city hall. I haven't heard anything from Tetyana, the story, how the Museum of the History of Ukraine represents Jewish community that is there at the Dnieper banks for over 1,000 years, starting with the Jewish gates and the events of 1917, where the Jewish community was engaged. And also I would like to ask Sofia Dyak whether she was telling to all of the invited speakers that there is the initiative group like this, and we are doing this to develop the concept for the resuming of the museum. Why didn't you have any suggestion? Because you are the well-known scientists and scholarships, and we could be invited, the members of the initiative group, to discuss the issue of the restoration of the Jewish Museum in Lviv, which is very important, because you cannot really throw away the Jewish community from the history of Lviv. That's why you, Sofia, actually launched this discussion. It's not about the labor code discussion. These are the Jewish days in the city hall. Yes, thank you. But I would like to remind that the topic of today's meeting is the museum future of the past, and we are talking about the historical museums. We discussed the Jewish museums a week ago, And there's also the issue trying to understand which institution the group of intellectuals represent. But let's have it as an open question. I have some suggestions, some of the general questions that have been mentioned already, but we would like to focus on that more. This is the question of personalization. Are you trying to show the personal stories? And Ihor mentioned a very good example of the Foreign Museum, and also the issues of inclusive approach. How would the visitors be engaged and trying to feel the exhibition and museum and the story you want to show? And maybe this is also the answer, how to get away from the grand narratives and show the personal stories. Rather, that will be more interesting and closer to the visitors. I suggest you choose a question you like most. You don't have to answer all of the questions. I could answer the first question. How do we make the museums closer to the people? As based on my experience, I could say that we've had many projects, and Yevhen Chervony also was engaged. These were the voices of the visitors. We've had the seminars, the trainings, the workshops, and we're trying to implement in our museums the approaches of recording the voices of the visitors, trying to understand what do the visitors find important in the exhibition after they analyze this exhibition. When we're talking about this imperative approach and imposing of the curator authority during the design and creation of the exhibition. On the other hand, there was a different approach. We would like to know ourselves what would the visitors need. There are specific methodologies how to do this, through questionnaires, through individual projects, interviews, etc. We had an interesting project in Ivan Honchar Museum about Vasil Krchevsky. We invited a large group of volunteers and we assigned certain tasks for them. So we actually placed an announcement to create the large experimental exhibition together. So we actually assigned and allocated the functions to each of them, people who would be in charge of design, of concept, of communications, of education programs. So this is quite an interesting experience, and this experience was interesting in the fact that the director of the museum, Petro Honchar, we had a dilemma and some sort of conflict even, because one of the most democratic directors of Kyiv museums, Petro Honchar, didn't feel quite comfortable. He, as a designer, as an artist, as a professional, would create the exhibitions in his museum space. And then a group of volunteers of young people would come and claim, we want to have the exhibition this way. It was a challenge for us and was an interesting experience. So it's all about finding this lively communication that would be quite efficient, so the people could understand where would the museum go, what are they doing, and how open they could be in cooperation in different spheres, like developing the exhibitions, designing the education programs, and enhancing the community and consolidating the community around the museums, and not to transform into the political project, as was rightfully mentioned by some of the speakers, and also you mentioned this. So there is a threat actually, but if museums manage to develop the strong communities of their supporters, not only the friends of the museum, but generally the people who attend the museum. So whenever the museum faces the problem with the land issues, or maybe firing the director, or maybe blocking of some of the education or museum project, the community voices shall be well heard, and then the museums will have a chance to be more independent and autonomous. And this is one of the solutions for the security and viability of the museums for the future. Let's use the microphone, because the interpreter will have to hear your words from the microphone to interpret them to our English-speaking friends. Shall we? I'll be brief. I would like to answer to this young lady. We do have the experience when we were developing the exhibitions and the museums, we had the sleepover experience. So we had the displaced children, we had this night in the museum. It was the theatrical sleepover experience. It was very brief, but we also highlighted some Ukrainian traditions. After they stayed for the sleepover in the museum, we could hear their conversations. They could never believe that in such a short time they could emerge into all of this atmosphere. We concluded with the songs and all of that, and actually they learned to dance, etc. And these were actually displaced persons from the Donbass. So we do know how to approach them, for example, as a target group, and we will also experiment to find approaches to the others. Thank you. I would like to answer to the young lady. You were the second one, she was the first one, so I will answer the first question, if you do not mind. We were taking our own way. We are monitoring the opinions of the visitors about their expectations from the museum. You can read many books or comments on different websites, but we do care, whatever selfish it might sound, about our visitors. We did the following way. We spent several months to have the questionnaires and polls, exit polls. No questionnaires because people are irritated to fill any forms. They don't want to indicate their telephone numbers or emails, but they are always ready to answer 2 or 3 questions. We designed these questions not to include any negative elements. It was a very simple question. What did you want to see in the museum? What did you like? And what do you feel is lacking? We didn't ask it, what didn't you like, actually. So after several months of this exit poll, we could see the representative answers of the expectations and the dislikes of our audiences. And this way, we could conclude about the needs that we would have to satisfy, and we adjusted our activities to meet the needs of our visitors. Maybe they had different expectations for other museums, so we did it this way. And today, when I was listening to the presentation of the strategy of the Lviv Historical Museum, I realized what we were lacking. We believe that the main information about the activity of the museum could be disseminated through the web page on the Facebook and the website. We would monitor the number of visitors and hits on the Facebook page. So over 2 years, we have the increase from 4,000 to 14,000 of followers. But actually, I realized that we need to order broader range survey to the sociologists, how the visitors get the information about the museum. You live in Lviv and you know what is going on in Lviv Historical Museum, and I would ask you to like our webpage on the Facebook profile, and you will get all of the news and you will see how many events we are running. These are the discussions and the exhibitions about Crimean Tatars. We have a lot of events on the history of Jews, and you will read about our 3-day-long workshop last autumn when there was the 75th anniversary of the Babin Yar disaster, and many institutions commemorated this event. And you will see our contribution to the discussions on the Jewish community in Kyiv, and you will see that we are not ignoring this topic, but talking about the establishment of the separate room on the Jewish history would be probably wrong in our opinion, because this way we will take them out and separate them from the entire history of Kyiv and Ukraine. So we wanted to have it in the following way, trying to show the Jewish community engagement and influence on the general history of Kyiv and Ukraine. So we're now preparing the exhibition about the repression that Ukrainian intelligentsia, rural population and the military suffered, but mostly these would be about the people that the majority does not know about. You will have their photographs and their stories. So our goal would be to show there was the fight against the Ukrainian nation in general. because both the military, both the people from villages and the intelligentsia had different nationalities, and they all suffered repression and persecution. We have already selected some cases that would show that the Lechaki revolver actually was facing the elite of the Ukrainian nation, and they wanted to destroy irrespective of their ethnic affiliation. I'll be brief, because my colleagues actually addressed this issue about the creation of the Jewish Museum in Lviv. I would take a different approach. I would be talking about the rebirth of the Jewish Museum in Lviv, because in 1934 the Jewish Museum, Jewish Community Museum in Lviv was established. It was hosted in a specific building many years ago. There was the initiative group who were ready to renovate this museum, but unfortunately it was all stumbling. I'm sorry for this bad word. It was stumbled at the fact that this building now belongs and is owned by the Jewish community, and the rabbi was not ready to have the Jewish museum in this building. So there is a willingness, there is a wish. We have something to include there. We have the people willing to do this, but the Jewish community of Lviv should also actually have some efforts added by the rabbi to allocate the facility, the building, to host this museum. The next issue is something that Evhen Chervony mentioned about the personalization of history, personification of history rather, or maybe anthropologization of history. This is actually the current trend in the history research, and this is changing the exhibition type of historical museum, but this is not the panacea in itself. It does not exclude some sort of ideological or subjective approach, as Sofia mentioned before. It depends on the facts that we select. Which persons or personalities do we select? We used to have Lenin and Stalin and others of the renowned personalities. We now have these personalities replaced for others, but does it solve a problem? I'm not sure about that. So now getting back to the question by Vasily Rasevich, do you have the staff, do you have the professional staff available? Well, you can never have the ideal conditions and perfect conditions for work. On the one hand, it's good, but on the other hand, it's bad, because each conclusion is best shaped in a discussion. So when we invited Jaroslav Hercak as an expert to talk about some issues, highlighting them, and then one of the experts approached me, one of the members of the museum staff approached me, why did you invite him? Let's invite Vasily Serhichuk, for example. Yes, of course, we have to take into account all of these feedback, and I believe this is the talent of the manager to be able to take into account the interests and the likes of the museum staff, because all of these are professionals, they know the facts, they're able to interpret them, but we have to conclude with a solution that we would offer to the community. This is a complicated way, this is the complicated road that we have to take, but we have to take it. And also I would like to answer your question. I forgot to mention, I will appreciate if you monitor the museum stores of all museums and you tell us where the visitors could buy the books in Yiddish. It's only in our museum store, and I think we could be proud of that, because the Yiddish language books are only available in our museum store by Duchy Litera Publishing House. And also, Josef Silzis willing to be in the supervisory council of our museum is an indicative fact. Thank you very much. And it is also very important not to have the exhibition too long, and also it's important to have our discussion fitting the timeline set. So we are about to conclude. I'm not sure about you, but I have the impression that we have more questions than answers after this conversation. So I'm not sure which direction our museums are going to take in their changes, but we would like to wish you good luck. What I know for sure is that the challenges are huge. For the museums headed by Roman or Tetyana, these are mostly the concept-based challenges, trying to understand what the history of Ukraine is. Is it only the history of the Ukrainian nation? And I'm afraid to ask this question, what the Ukrainian nation is, because we will start the new discussion, which will take the same long. But the good news is that we probably heard Ihor talking about the social responsibility of museums, and I think we could have many repairs in our museums, but I believe the major change would be about attitude in how we see the history. Can we change the structure of telling the story, not just replacing one characters by the others, one white spots to other white spots? I just remembered about the exhibition next to Volodymyrska No. 2 Museum on the Andreevsky descent, talking about the history of the Ukrainian liberation fights and personifying them with the help of the reconstruction. These are men, but also several women wearing the uniforms of different military divisions of different centuries, and mostly of the 20th century. We will see the Cossacks, then siege riflemen. We will see the Ukrainian People's Republic soldiers and the Western Ukrainian People's Republic and the Galician army and the Ukrainian insurgency army and the modern army, but we will not see the Soviet army uniform. And actually that bothered me, that concerned me a lot, because this is also the family story of many people who are citizens of Ukraine. And this is the heritage and the legacy we could have different opinions about, but we have no right to be silent about that. We have too huge the experience of silence, and we paid a high price for this silence. So if we don't start talking about the contested topics of the museums, if the museums are not courageous enough to talk about it, then it will go beyond the museums. And then it could be really scary then. The concept and breaking the links between the museum and the state, refocusing to be oriented on the society, because in the end, we are the taxpayers, we are getting the benefits. Thank you.